Hello there, and welcome back to another Bo&Joe podcast. I'm Bo.
I'm Joe.
And tonight is Joe's turn to bring a subject to the table, but I do want to let everybody know he does have a little bit of a cold.
Yeah, it's all right. Well, I thought it would be interesting to talk about something which we've, glanced on many times or touched on many times while we've talked about ancient civilizations.
Right.
So tonight I wanted to talk about the problem with Atlantis.
Okay. That's an interesting approach.
Right. So there's multiple problems, and I wanted to lay some of these out as a way of just trying to go about some of the stuff that people, I guess you could say misconceptions that people have about it.
So we're going to talk tonight, to summarize for the listeners, we're going to talk about the misconceptions and potentially myths.
Yeah, or some of the less known things.
Okay.
And some of the misnomers and stuff like that. So first I wanted to ask you, when was the first time you heard of Atlantis?
I think most of us will probably have heard of Atlantis when we did mythology in school.
Really?
Yeah, for me it was. I'm a little older, but so go ahead.
I'm sorry so that's very interesting because at least for my education, we never talked about it in school.
Really? Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in a military environment, so I went to a lot of schools I was overseas for at least half my life.
Interesting.
And so the schools were all military based. They weren't actual where you had to wear uniforms, but they were militarily sponsored.
Oh, okay.
And the curriculum tended to be more advanced than what you would find here in the States during that time.
Wow.
So I remember having been in Germany in, I guess, my freshman year. Mm-hmm. And I came back from Germany shortly after I'd started the freshman year and went into a freshman session of an American school.
Yeah.
And I was so far ahead that they actually docked me points.
Wow.
So I had to go back and start a bunch of those classes over. And conversely, when I left the American side and went back to Germany, I had been able to do in my free time a bunch of the extra classes, and I only needed like 4 more credits to graduate.
Oh, wow.
So the curriculum was a lot harder, a lot more vast too. I don't know if that was because we were overseas or
maybe,
or what the case was, but actually we had a mythology class where I learned initially when I was very young. I'm thinking probably 6 or 7.
Right.
The first time I was in Germany. And we learned about the Greek gods. We learned about Atlantis.
Wow.
We learned about a lot of the Roman myths and whatnot.
Right. Can I ask you, I know it's, and you probably might not remember, but do you remember how they went about talking about Atlantis? Did they tell you any details? Did they ask you to read some of Plato's work?
I mean, they didn't, at the time, no, they didn't ask us to read Plato. Mm-hmm. They did tell us about Plato, who had written a story about a fictional place named Atlantis.
Interesting.
And the key word fictional.
Fictional. Interesting. So that's one of the misnomers I wanted to talk about. So for me, at least, I never ever heard of it at school. I did hear about it in passing in my house and with my parents and things like that, but never in school. Only until when I went to college. When I went to college and I started taking philosophy, specifically philosophy, that's when I actually started.
So you never heard about Atlantis until you were in college?
No. I did before, but I mean, like the what really took me aback when you said in school is one of my biggest points I wanted to talk about is for most people that I've asked this, most of them have never ever heard it in school. So I think first, it's great that you had such a good education. That's awesome, man. But second, it's interesting that something that's not given that much here, because a lot of the people that I've asked are from the States, not just from Puerto Rico.
I understand.
And so that's a very interesting point, and I didn't expect that. But the reason I wanted to talk about it is because in the actual book, Plato specifies.
What's the name of the book?
So there's two. So, okay, it's better to preface this with a little bit of Plato's work. So almost everything, literally everything we know about Atlantis comes from Plato's. Plato wrote 2 books. One was called Critias and the other one was called Timaeus. There's different characters in these books. Critias is the name of his great uncle, who he got a lot of this information from a descendant of his called Solon. We'll talk about Solon later. There's another person inside of his work that's called Critias as well, and he's a fictional character. But the important thing to note is that the work itself stems from the Critias and the Timaeus. That's the 2 books from Plato that mention Atlantis. So what I wanted to touch on is the fact that Plato literally says his actual words, even if it's strange, it is a true story. So Plato himself never says that it's fake. So that's what I meant by misnomer. A lot of people see it as an allegory, especially when you study philosophy, because of things that we will later talk about. But what I found very interesting about, first, the fact that you actually learned about it in school, and then second, that the teacher was saying it's fake.
Well, I mean, I think anytime something that can be perceived as magic is mentioned or discussed openly, people are inherently inclined to say, no, that's not real. It's obviously a myth.
Well, I mean, there's no magic, really. The only thing that you could consider to be quote-unquote magical is when he describes the people. He describes the people as being, let's say, extrasensory. So you've ever heard of Jung's idea of the collective unconscious?
Absolutely. I'm a huge Jung fan.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
me too. I love Jung. So they, the way that it's written, it talks about this collective unconscious which allowed them to, create great feats, which I guess you could confuse or consider some sort of magic. I just think that they were more attuned to themselves and to nature, right? I think that happens also with children, but we're kind of straying from the subject here. But
isn't it somewhere in the books it mentions that Atlanteans are ageless people?
Not ageless. So I guess we could go into a little bit of the story. So another thing that's a misnomer is that they are considered to be this utopian society, right?
Right.
Realistically, they were a warring society. They were one of the biggest reasons why supposedly the gods cast them down into the, catastrophe that we know of in the book was because of their hubris and their arrogance. So apparently they rose to such a great height of power that megalomania set in, and they wanted to conquer pretty much the entire world. They believed that they were the true, and I hate to say it, Aryan race, or the true, what the elite race, or what was those
master race?
Thank you. Yes, yeah. So they made it up in their heads that they were above everything else.
So the Atlanteans, this is the first I've ever heard of an Atlantean race being warlike.
Oh man, they were extremely warlike, man. So at the time they were seafaring people, which another misnomer that I wanted to talk about is when you heard of it. And I know that we're kind of skipping, but it's important. How did you see it? Do you see it as an island?
Initially, when you're talking about when I first heard about it.
Right.
And maybe I'm a little strange, I openly admit that, but when the imagery was given to me, I envisioned roads of like white ivory and pyramids, actually.
Okay.
Which I always thought was weird.
No, it's not weird. I mean, I totally get it. No, the reason I ask is because a lot of people say it's one island, right? Because in Plato's work, he mentions...
It's concentric, right?
It's a concentric, yeah, but he mentions that one island, which is, the name of that island is Poseidonis. Okay. So what people don't know is that it was a diffusion. Atlantis was not just one island. He was talking about the last bit of that empire, which was Poseidonis. But the entirety of it was 7 huge islands inside of the Atlantic Ocean. So each one of them had... So the story goes there was 7 twins, or 7 set of twins that were anointed by the gods that got to be the rulers of each one of these islands and help make that great and most powerful empire of Atlantis, become what it turned into. Apart from that, there's a lot of other things that come into play, but the important part about this is it was a diffusion. It was never just one island, which is another misnomer that I wanted to, touch on. As far as the interesting aspects of the diffusion part is that they were influencing everything. They were merchants, so they had a great mercantile. They were almost everywhere on the planet. So it wasn't just in the Atlantic Ocean. And from their seafaring nature, they dominated pretty much everything. So because of that, because of their mercantile, because of their understanding of navigation and their technology in regards to sailing, they basically ruled the entire 7 seas. So
I find it unusual that, and this is by no means countermanding anything that you've added, but I find it interesting to hear that they were militant and that they were so...
the mercantile part?
I was going to try and think of a word, mercantilious. I don't know if that's a good word. But,
entrepreneurial-like? I don't know.
well, let's go with it. But I find it difficult to hear that and know that there are no traces, at least no known traces of their influence anywhere in the world.
I love the fact that you just mentioned that. That brings me to my other point of the misnomer. We only know of the time that was mentioned in the Timaeus and the Critias, which mentions, in Solon's own words, 9,000 years prior to his time, which makes it 11,600 years ago where this catastrophe happened.
So Younger Dryas period.
Exactly. But the important aspect is that it's much older than that. So if you go from the legend, and here again, here's where we completely break from history and go 100% into legend. Apparently, the empire lasted for over 25,000 years. So it was not something that only occurred 11,600 years ago. 11,600 years ago was the demise of that civilization. So, and to your question, what happened, right? Like, where's all their information? So right. I think it's all around us, especially when you consider most of the megalithic structures on the planet. So,
explain.
The diffusion aspect of Atlantis. It not only did it take into account the mercantile or whatever you want to call it aspect,
sure,
and their warring aspect, but just like the Romans, the Spanish, and pretty much every other culture that's such great of an empire, they sent out envoys, they sent out quote-unquote priests to spread their ideals, to try and indoctrinate peoples. And you see that in some of the legends and myths across the world. So one of the most, I guess you could say, echoing myth is God or goddess or a god-like person or beings that come from the ocean. Usually they described it as a fish-like being,
sure,
or properties of a fish. Like
I've heard stories, yeah.
Yep, in Sumeria they called them Oanis, and they described them as a half-fish or fish-like person with scales, and
right,
had like emblems or like symbols in his chest, and had a very weird like a mitre hat on, and it's weird. But this whole idea of a person coming from the ocean and teaching a group of very lowly technology, like extremely low technology, very little, no type of civilization was known at this time. So this is pre-Sumeria. This is before all that. This is very, very ancient past. So we're talking about 12,000, 13,000, more than that. Like ancient stories. Right. And again, a lot of these are legends, but you see these legends echoing across the entire world.
So we'd be looking at about 36,000 years away from the current time.
Well, yeah, but the legends of the teachers are not that far off. So the teachers came many years after. For example, I forgot the exact name, but it's the people that lived in Mesopotamia. Those are the ones who called them Oanis, the person who came from the water.
Right.
In China, same idea. A person who came from the water that taught them. In India, the first incarnation of Vishnu, from the water, from a fish's mouth. In South America, you have Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl. Both of them come from the ocean. It's basically the same dude, different name. It depends on which civilization.
Quetzalcoatl comes from the ocean?
Yeah, Quetzalcoatl is a winged serpent.
I thought he was lightning.
No, so the idea of Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan both are a person, a specific person, which is described as a Caucasian-looking man with a long beard, which had a plumed, that's why it was called the plumed serpent. Apparently he had these very colorful plumes in his what he was wearing. And he came riding on snakes. I know it's very theatrical, fantastic, and dramatic, yeah. From the ocean onto the shores, and he took them under his wing and taught them about civilization, and taught them about understanding astronomy and astrology and the nature of the gods.
So are we saying, allow me to back up just a moment, the information you're providing is good,
yeah,
but I want to make sure that not only for myself but for the listeners that we get our ducks in a row. You're saying the topic of this is the problems with Atlantis.
Yeah, the misnomers.
So we're saying that problem number one is that everybody believes it was a myth,
right? Whereas
Plato has indicated this was real.
Well, I mean, so yeah, that's a very okay.
So that's a good starting point.
Right. And first and foremost, again, I don't want to make this is not my personal opinion. Is yes, I do believe that the story is based on some modicum of truth. Okay. That's just my own personal opinion.
I would also agree.
Yeah. Because myths and legends usually come from some breadcrumb of truth.
I agree.
Apart from that, he does mention it as such in the book. So
that's true.
If people wanna read, they can actually read the Timaeus and the Critias, and they will see that he says, although strange, it is a true story.
Okay, so We're saying then that the problem number 2 with Atlantis is that they were aggressive. What we can call aggressive is a good generic term.
Well, the utopian nature of the society is not true. They were of
Okay, so problem number 2,
arrogant.
Atlantis was not a utopia.
Right. It was an arrogant civilization. Their downfall came from their hubris and from their megalomania.
That's is it possible for a single society to have megalomania?
Well, I mean, okay, that's a good point. No, I don't believe you can say a group can have megalomania. You're right.
Okay.
But I'm trying to use some type of
A generalization.
Yeah, but no, absolutely not. I don't think that one society can have that, because I think for the most part, a lot of the people and the way that it was described. So I'm going to try and do the Cliff Notes. A short version is he talks about how great the society was, how
He being Plato?
yeah, and he uses characters in his work, and here's where we also have to be very specific. Yes, in his work he uses fictional characters like the person Critias. There's a person named Critias inside of the story, which is fake. It's not anybody. But so that's the part where it makes it a little bit more difficult, right? Because we're talking about something that might be based in truth, but that yet there's fictional characters. So that's where the whole allegory part comes from. So most people, philosophy professors, most people that teach myths and legends see this as an allegory. So the entirety of Atlantis is just an allegory of what happens when power goes to people's heads. In other words, the entire story falls to the ending of that, catastrophe that occurred. In one night and one day, the entire civilization, or at least the island, sunk. And the reason for it was the people of Atlantis went against the gods' wishes. The gods gave them warnings. They told them, do not go into this, egotistical way of being. You have to be in balance, not just with your fellow man, but with nature. And they went completely against it. They believed that because of their advancement in technology and their knowledge, that they were above everything, including the gods. And they were struck down.
So, as a matter of opinion, what do you think, what were their levels of technology? What would be comparable?
Good question. So, at least if we go from what was written, they had close to what you can conceive of the Phoenicians' technology when it came to sailing. So they had very advanced ships, very advanced nautical knowledge. And for the more fantastical stuff, yeah, there's some modicum of magic, as you mentioned, or some modicum of fantastical things, which came from their power of intuition. But that's more of their intuned or their, when their harmonic connection to nature and things and to each other. So I don't know how far you can go with that, because when they talk about their constructions and their buildings and their temples and how everything was laid out, everything seemed pragmatic. Everything seemed like it had a purpose and a point. It wasn't about form, more of function.
Right.
So it reminds me more of it's weird. It's like the beginning of the Vulcans, and then they took a really weird turn and turned into, I don't know, what's the Borg? Not the Borg. What's the warlike guys? What were they?
Klingons.
Klingons, yeah.
Actually, I believe, completely unrelated, but I believe that there is a genetic relationship between Klingons and Vulcans.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm fairly certain that's true. It's not entirely relevant, so I apologize.
No, that's cool, man.
So my thought process on that is, keeping in tune with what we're talking about, problem number 2, about them not being utopian, I don't know that there's ever been any kind of scientific discovery or archaeological discovery that has indicated, A, that Atlantis has ever been located. And I believe we have a couple ideas, and we can talk about that.
Yeah, the location is part of the misnomer, by the way.
Good. But I have never seen somebody provide to me an image of something and say this is an Atlantean artifact.
Right.
I do recall hearing some years ago that they had found an orb or a crystal ball of some sort that was buried in the ocean floor, and they couldn't extract it. And it had a high magnetism, and they were saying that this was where the sunken city was supposed to be. I haven't even thought about it until just now, so I don't know how accurate that is.
So I have not heard that. It's really interesting, man. I want to check that stuff out. I have not heard of that. As far as where it was, I think before we get to that, to tackle your first point of where the remnants are, to circle back to that part.
Right. For a warlike society, you
Yeah.
leave a lot of trace.
But here's the thing. If you think about, there's this very weird show about After People, I think it's called, in Discovery Channel. I think it came and went. It only had like maybe 8 or 10 episodes.
Okay.
Each one of them showed what would happen if civilization as we know it would cease to be. What would happen to our constructions, our buildings, what would happen to the big, what is it, Khalifa, that huge building?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what would happen to all these places,
Yeah.
And in a long enough timeline of a short 1,000 to 2,000 years, it would all be gone. There would be nothing left. The only thing that we would see would be things like the Hoover Dam, for example. Pretty much anything and everything constructed out of metal would disappear.
Yeah, stone primarily.
Yeah, exactly. So, if we go through that same narrative and follow the stone work and follow the megalithic structures across the planet, and then correlate that to their idea or their, not the mercantile aspect of them, but I guess you could say they're what the Spanish used to do. Not emissaries, they're when they were trying to convert people. The Spanish sent a lot of the
Inquisition?
not the Inquisition. No.
That was all about conversion. Maybe not the good one.
Yeah, trial by fire. No, but I mean, what I meant to say is they sent out a lot of emissaries across the world to convert what they believed as heathens into the true path, right?
I see.
So they had a group of different priests that went throughout the world, not only trying to spread some of the good knowledge, and by good knowledge I mean astronomy, astrology. This is extremely important for them, and other things, as it were. A root of the mystery schools can be traced up to that specific time of the Atlantean diffusion. And that's another topic. But what I'm trying to say is they scoured the entire world. So an important point, before the cataclysm occurred, they knew that it was going to happen. They were masters of astronomy, masters of astrology. What we know as the catastrophe, it was, you could call it a deluge. Which also brings us to another point of the actual word Atlantis. It's not based in Greek. It's not based in Latin. If you look at the etymology of it, it's difficult to find a root. And the only closest thing that we can find would be atoll. And atoll comes also from another book that's found in dang it, I forget, Spain. The Conquistadors, one of the last books, let me see if I can find the name of the book. I have it written down. It was one of the last pieces of the Mayan culture. And this book, it's called the Codex Roano.
Codex Roano?
Yeah, Codex Roano. It's one of the surviving documents, and it's in I forget the name of the museum, but you can see it if you ever visit Spain. I think it's in Barcelona. And it mentions that glyph, atoll. And the translation of the atoll glyph is deluge. And it's really funny.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and if you want to know the name, it's Codex Troano, and it's Troano.
Okay.
Hopefully
I've never heard of it.
Yeah. So it's one of the last remaining documents from the Mayans. It's another thing a lot of people don't know about, just again straying from the subject. A lot of what the conquistadors used to do is anything and everything that they found that went against their narrative, they would destroy.
Well, that follows the old adage that history is written by the victors.
Yeah, exactly, or erased.
Yeah, that too.
But anyways, back to the point. These cultures, and something we kind of jumped on one point or another, and I know I do that a lot and I apologize, but going back to the main point and circling back of the idea of how the remnants, or where are the remnants. So there was a correlation a long time ago, especially to the creation of the Sphinx, not the pyramids, but the Sphinx. And the correlation came, and again, I know correlation doesn't equal causation, but it's important to mention it. The idea was the people who built the Sphinx, apparently, and again, this comes from one of, I believe it was Babal's book, Robert Babal. They believed that they were remnants from this ancient mother civilization, quote unquote, the Atlantean civilization. Okay. Which helped build the Sphinx as we know it. So if you want to look at things that might contain what we would consider proof, would be first and foremost, it would be there, the Sphinx. There's also another more controversial legend that falls into a temple in a place called Sais in Egypt. So, and for this, we have to talk about Solon. So Solon was a very important character. He lived about 300 years before the time of Plato. Solon is the person who actually went to Egypt and studied with the priests of Egypt in the mystery schools, and who was the person who actually got the information. So it does not come from Plato. Plato is only transcribing information that he got from a second source. So again, the important thing is what happened with Solon. When Solon was in Sais, he was introduced to the mystery schools by a couple of priests. One of them, I forgot his name. I have it written down. We can talk about it a little bit later. But he showed him information that is contained and it's basically passed over inside of the mystery schools. And a lot of it came from an ancient civilization. And all of this information was presented to him in a variety of different forms. Some of it was written in hieroglyphs. Some of it was written in the last part of the legend, which I wanted to leave for the last, which we can talk about a little later. But the point of all this is when Solon was getting the descriptions of all this information, one of the things that was taught to him was that they were considered to be teachers. And they were not, it was not something that was singular to Egypt. In other words, you could see the remnants of this civilization across the world. So if you were looking for evidence of Atlantis, all you got to do is look at all the megalithic sites and look for the mysterious aspects of some of those megalithic sites, and look for the correlations of the legends and the myths inside of those megalithic sites. And you'll see that a lot of it boils down to some singular character or singular group of characters that basically sing the same song. Teachers, people who created the knowledge that was needed to brew civilization. And I think, if anything, if you just look at history with a wider view, you could start looking at the breadcrumbs of that ancient civilization. So to put it in Graham Hancock's words, it's, I believe the easiest way of describing it is we were a civilization with amnesia. So after this deluge, after and this is another topic for another podcast, after the whole cataclysm of the Younger Dryas occurred, civilization was brought to the brink of extinction. And when you have such a gargantuan event like that, people lose what you would consider not technology, but yeah, even technology, everything. I mean, your way of life changes in such a dramatic way that you're just in survival mode. So your descendants are going to be stuck in this survival mode as well. So the most important bits and pieces of culture and technology get lost. So I think, if anything, that's what happened. We have a diffusion, and in the ends of this diffusion, we see the civilization going into this complete and utter chaos of just trying to dominate and utilize power in the most corrupt way. And we see their demise. But before that, we see that they were doing, I guess, what some of them believe was the only way of continuing their culture, which was going literally everywhere they could and leaving seeds, and leaving these small seeds of information and knowledge so that they could pass that on. Because the true location, I think, or the true legacy of Atlantis is the knowledge that we today consider as lost, but we might just have the wrong idea. It's just misinformed. So if anything, my quote-unquote, I guess you could say, belief is that a lot of the ancient knowledge that we have, and especially the ones that come from the mystery schools, come from that civilization.
Oh, I can't argue. I can't argue because I don't know. It goes without saying, I have no evidence or information that says, that Atlantis was real. I've never seen any artifact where they said definitively this is Atlantean. And granted, based on the time frame, we're looking at 30,000 plus years ago. Yeah. Why would it be around unless it was made of stone? Right. But then my question becomes, if the society was advanced, what are we talking about for the level of advanced?
Yeah, I forgot. You asked me a while ago that. So, from what I read, it was not something, like a lot of the times that's another misnomer. They talk about like flying ships and a bunch of crazy stuff. No, it's like, it was much more leveled or granular, not granular. It was much more down to earth than what people believe it to be. It was not like UFOs flying everywhere. Okay. There was Yes, there was a legend based on another legend, based on another legend, and I couldn't find it, about flying machines.
Right.
But I don't know if that's true. As far as the books go, they describe high culture, high civilization, understanding of agronomy, agriculture, astrology, astronomy, architecture, engineering, everything and anything you can think of, even things that were attributed to the Greeks, far, far more advanced than that. But again, we're only talking about the type of things that you would, I guess, the only way of describing it would be a different type of technological advancement. It wouldn't be computers. It wouldn't be that type of things that you and I would consider to be highly advanced. It would be other ways of doing things that we do it differently. So their navigational instruments, their ability to understand the stars and things like that. So they kind of melded, but this is something that happened a lot in the ancient past, astronomy and astrology in a big way.
Of course. So I don't want to jump too far off the ship or the context of your conversation here. Are there additional problems that you want to bring to the air?
Yeah, the location. So
Okay,
this is
great.
something you mentioned, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So you shared with me a really good video that talked about a possible new location, which was that Eye of the Sahara,
Right.
Which is very interesting, and I found it to be very intriguing. As far as it stands, though, I don't know. He was very specific of where the location was, and there's many different ideas or legends from other civilizations and cultures, like even in Ireland. See, I got it right this time. It's not England. But
Good job.
Yeah. But in Ireland, they have, this is something that they teach in school over there. They teach their legends about the ancient kings and even teach about this mythical land, which was an island that disappeared and reappeared. And that was another topic that I want to touch on, another conversation in another podcast. It's called High Brazil. And
I've heard of High Brazil.
Yeah. So there's many different legends around the world that talk about similar situations of civilizations that were advanced that came from this, weird place in the sea, which they attribute magical properties. And when I mean magical, I mean mysterious, not magical. That's not the right word. So, for example, High Brazil, it appeared and disappeared. And, the only real account was, I think some Portuguese merchants apparently got landed there after a storm, and they met this man who was the only person living there. And what's really weird is they describe it filled with these huge rabbits, like just gargantuan looking rabbits, bigger than anything they have ever seen. And they met this one person there who brought them to this great castle, and inside of the castle they saw things that were, it's kind of a melding of timelines if you think about it. Like some of it look ancient, some of it look modern, and this was in the 1800s, so that they were very confused. And in the last bit of it, they noticed that they had so much wealth. The person, he had innumerable amounts of gold and things that they just believed to be fantastical. And in the end, he told them, "This is the last time you'll be able to see this island," and they've sent them on their way after he gave them food and shelter. But we're getting off the subject. So to your point, the fusion aspect, the idea of the space of where it was, Poseidonis is the only one that was described to a T. That's the one you mentioned. There was a circular, concentrical
Right.
island formation. So they described everything, but they also described where it was, right? He says across the pillars of Hercules, or Heracles, that's what they called it in the day, which is, that's off the coast of Spain, in between Spain and Africa. And right after that, after the cataclysm, he mentions that it got so bad that no ship could pass. It was basically turned into mud, which that's another part that Jimmy from Bright Insight mentions in his video. He says that it would make sense if you look at the striations in the sand and the way that the water erosion occurred. You would, and again, it sounds accurate, but I don't know. It's too far inland in my mind. I mean, maybe if it was 50,000 years ago, maybe that was part of it, but not Poseidonis. So that's the part that I wanted to touch on. There's a lot of misnomers around where it was placed because almost nobody knows. Like, there's very little, if anything, that's factual about that story that we can actually trace historically. And the only things that we can definitely know for sure is if we go and take him by his word, then it's not in that area. And that would mean that it's also not in Cuba, or that it's also not in Antarctica. There's so many places across the world that people have said that Atlantis is, you know. I think that if anything, there were 7 islands. The size of it was gargantuan. And the ancestry part was the other part, the other portion that I want to talk about, the other misnomer. They weren't the oldest. So a lot of people think that that's the oldest civilization. That mythical Atlantis civilization was the oldest. It was not. That's just the 6th incarnation of a high society. We're the 7th.
You've actually brought, in just your statement right there, you've made me think of another logistical issue with what we're talking about, another problem with Atlantis. You've indicated that their civilization lasted for an estimated of 25,000 years.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
So we here in America are several million deep, and I think we're at like 8 billion around the world, right?
Something like that. We're 335 million people.
Just here in America.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that number there's a mathematical formula that predicts how humanity expands every year.
Yeah.
And something to the effect of 200 years ago, we were like 60% of this number or less. You see where I'm going with this?
You know how many people died when the sinking of Atlantis?
Well, I imagine most of them. But
the number, it's mentioned.
It's also mentioned.
It's something that not a lot of people know about. Not a misnomer, just one of the unknowns. 60 million people.
60 million.
Yep. Just on Poseidonis.
Over 7 islands. That's pretty big.
No, just Poseidonis. That's why it gets confusing. He mentions and talks about mostly Poseidonis. He talks about the diffusion aspect, but he focuses on Poseidonis.
70 million people.
60.
60. I'm sorry. I don't know where I got 70. So I'm curious. I'm looking up the population of Tokyo, because I'm pretty sure that's one of the most popular.
Really?
Popular, yeah. So 9 million people live in the city of Tokyo. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And that's why they're starting to build up instead of out, because they're on an island.
Yep.
So how big is Poseidonis? Or I'm sorry, it's obviously not an island now.
Good question. I believe it was about, I don't know the diameter exactly, but point to point, maybe 6,000 kilometers, something around there.
Okay.
It was big.
That's an awful lot of people on one island.
Yeah, it's big, man. It was a big island. But again, that's just one island. There's many. There was not just that one island. He describes it in the book, and he uses a different measurement. I forget the name of it. Scalas, I think, or Skila. Anyways, but he describes everything. There's measurements. It's pretty granular. So that's another thing that I don't understand, how this is always labeled as just an allegory, because there's some very specific information in this work. It's not just some crazy story to teach people about hubris and arrogance, you know? Like, you wouldn't go into such detail. And being a person of such high regard, and just very shortly, I wanted to get into Plato's life. Plato was a person that came from blue blood. You know what blue blood stands for? So blue blood is usually royal blood, or from a very well standing place in society. So what I'm trying to say is Plato came from a very wealthy and very well situated family. So he did not have to do all the things that he was doing. He could have just laid in the weeds and ate a bunch of grapes and, go to a bunch of parties and not care of anything. This guy did not do that. He dedicated his life towards the pursuit of knowledge, right? He was a very serious person. So why would such a person just talk about the way he talks about this legend or this story, say that it's true if it's not? You see what I mean? And that's the one thing that I honestly think is most of the times is completely not even mentioned when they talk about the story, is that he did not say that it was fake. He said that even though it's strange, it's true. So why would such a serious person say that?
Well, it's an interesting, to me, it's not paradoxical, but it seems to have caught itself. You say that he did say that it was true, right? But at the same time, he's using a character that isn't.
Right.
So, like I said, not paradoxical.
No, but it's
a
strange
choice word.
No, but it's definitely strange. But again, a lot of the idea of the description of the place, the behavior of the people, their pursuit of knowledge, their pursuit of of having complete dominance, I guess you could say, because they were very similar to what you compare to the Nazis. They believed that they were the high society, the master race, or whatever you want to call it. They believed that they had the power and the will to conquer anything and everything, so much so that they went against the gods, So they had that same type of mentality that it's, them and them only, and they should rule.
Okay.
So, I mean, yeah, maybe there's a lot of things that are weird when it comes to the way that he describes them, but even so, I just don't understand why a person like that would say this is true if it wasn't.
So before we address some of those issues, I want to make sure you get a chance to hit everything still. Mm-hmm. Are there additional problems you want to throw out there?
No, there's a couple of, mistakes here and there, but no, those are the more important ones that I wanted to talk to. I mean, okay. They're more, but for now, there's too much to talk about in just 1 hour, so I wanted to keep it, at least light.
I understand.
Yeah.
So I believe that, I butcher this name every time I say it, but I believe a lot of the historically or fictionally speaking that Egypt was actually founded by a member of Atlantis.
Yeah. So the story or the legend goes, yes, yeah, not Egypt itself, but the high culture of Egypt.
Right.
Yeah. So
what we know to be the culture of Egypt, pyramids,
right.
So that was Thoth? Is that how it's pronounced?
Yep. Thoth was the scribe of the gods, the one who taught everybody. Yep.
So he's
the original, well, not original, but far back as you could trace it, the original teacher of the mystery schools.
That I did not know.
Yep.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So is it supposed to be Thoth who went to the Mayans and to, across Europe and everything?
Good point. So it's extremely perplexing because it's the exact, well, not the exact same, but close to the exact same description in almost all of the legends and myths across the planet. Not just the Mayans and even before them. We're talking about ancient times. They describe the same thing. So they describe a very similar looking person or people. I don't believe it's the same person. It couldn't have been. Because we're talking about some of these occasions are in similar times. Mm-hmm. Some of them are totally different times. So I really cannot conceive it being the same person. As far as Thoth, I think he had the biggest influence. Obviously, if you just take a look at Egypt, you can definitely understand. But I do not believe it was Thoth. I believe that there were multiple priests that went throughout the world, and a lot of them had the same type of look to them. They were Caucasian. They had a pretty, athletic builds. They were described to be wearing long beards and some type of armor, which was usually described as scales or I don't know, metallic in some way or shape or form. And they had symbols usually in their chests.
So I find that interesting, and that leads me back to another part of the Atlantean issue that you mentioned. I understand that Thoth was supposed to be, like, deific.
Yeah, he was a god.
Right. And if you're a deity, mm-hmm. then aren't you, by definition, immortal?
Well, so that depends. We talked about this a while ago, between the gods with the small g's and God with the big g's.
I see. Okay.
So a lot of these different gods, quote-unquote gods, like Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl, and, I don't mean to step on any types of, sensitive lines here, but also when you talk about Vishnu and all these different characters throughout the world, these were mentioned, and some of them, like Vishnu, very important gods, very powerful gods. But in my mind, I think, back to your point about magic, maybe it was just godlike in the sense of their knowledge.
I see.
I don't think that it was really an actual person that was an actual, super being.
I see. No,
it's just like an extremely knowledgeable person.
So we're talking, you're talking lowercase g, as you said.
Yeah.
As in science that's so advanced, it's basically magic to you.
Exactly. You know what's interesting about that? You know why that new book of Graham is called Magicians of the Gods? That's why that's what the Egyptians called them. They called them the magicians.
I see.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So the magicians were the teachers.
So I want to back that up to the additional link you mentioned about how the society fell because of their hubris and their spitting in the face of the gods. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if Obviously, you don't subscribe to that as being what really happened.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I'm looking more of a. You don't actually believe that it was Atlantis being punished by
an actual god?
By an actual god.
No. If anything, this would fall into complete and utter fanciful, thinking. Not anything based on anything. Just my own, musings. I would believe that if you go back to the idea of how far back these civilizations come from, because we haven't even touched on the fact that this is the sixth incarnation of a great society. There's been much more before them. So if anything, if they were the teachers of our current cultures, then that would mean that there would have to be older teachers from an older culture, pre-Atlantis, back to the time of Lemuria. And if you go farther back to the time of Mu. If you go farther back to the time of Agartha. So each civilization has come and went, and then you see this trend of disobedience and fall, which is basically the historical, timeline. It's disobedience and then fall, then rise, then disobedience and fall, and the same thing over and over again, and repeats. Well, even in the Vedic scripts, they talk about, I think it was 6 or 7 civilizations prior to the one we're currently on, and this is 5,000 years old. So if we go by that, if anything, those gods with little g's that they considered to be the ones who were warning them of hubris, I think it was just the teachers of the older cultures. So that's just my own musings. Like the idea of who was the person who was higher than they were, who were considered the gods of Olympus, right? And in his own words, right? Poseidon. If anything, that would be the people that came from, the prior islands, prior civilizations. And those, those descriptions of those cultures, those are definitely, on the border of magic and wizardry and stuff that I don't even want to talk about right now.
I've never heard the theory of the 6 previous societies. I've never heard that.
So that brings me to the one last thing I want to talk about. There's a lot of mysterious things around Solon, and I just wanted to mention the legend of what happened when Solon was in this temple of Sais in Egypt. He was brought to an underground structure in the temple. After he was showed the inscriptions and the hieroglyphs of the temple of Sais describing some of the works and some of the aspects of how these magicians taught the priests that were currently there, and he was being introduced to the mystery schools. So they brought him down. Inside, he saw a huge, and this was just a chasm beneath the temple. It was not like a chamber or anything. It was literally a huge chasm, like a cave. Inside of this huge structure, he saw a huge lake. And inside of the lake, he saw an island, a small island, the edge in the center of the lake. And when they walked towards the edge of the lake, they saw a blind ferryman. Again, this is a legend, but it's just interesting how many echoes you can hear of things from Dante and things like that. And the blind ferryman, they don't have to pay him anything. He takes them to the center of the island, to the center of the lake, which was a small island. In the center, they find these 2 columns. These 2 columns were made of what they described as orichalcum, or some type of unbreakable metal, like a alloy of some sorts. And in these columns was described a history of 7 civilizations. Each one talked about, and again, so this is the priest talking to Solon.
Right.
He was telling Solon, a long time ago, we knew how to read these glyphs. But from the time of my ancestors to the time of myself, we are only carried the stories through word of mouth because they forgot how to read it. It was supposedly written in the original language, which was lost to the edges of time. And so what they were talking about was what happened to the first civilization, how it came up to its peak and then fell. So he went through each one. The important one was right before the one of Atlantis. He mentions that one fell to fire. Then when he talks about the one of Atlantis, he mentions that one fell to the flood, to the deluge. And then he mentioned, but if the timeline continues, and so it shall, the next civilization will come to a different type of peak in high culture. and that one will have its end come from the skies. So in this is really old stuff. He was talking about the end of our civilization that was written in those frickin' tablets. I mean, in those frickin' whatchamacallits, columns. And that just blew my mind, man. Because, I mean, he literally said in the legend that the end of our species would come from the skies.
Now, what do you think that means?
Frickin' nuclear weapons, man.
Wouldn't that be fire?
Well, no, because it came from the sky. If you can't, so if a nuclear bomb were to be detonated, they would not detonate it in the ground. They would detonate it in the sky.
Of course, yeah.
So that's what I mean. Like the end would come from the sky.
And that's interesting to hear you say that. I just liken nuclear death to fire. I mean,
no, I get it. I'm just saying, like the actual fact of them having this legend that mentions an ending to a civilization that hadn't even begun to flourish. I mean, to be in the sky, right? I mean, it's amazing, right? Because at that time, there was no such thing as flight. There was no such thing.
I think it's interesting that you and I take such a different view on it. When I hear that, my first thought is like an asteroid or something to that effect. But I guess it is an asteroid that caused the Younger Dryas.
Right.
Or a comet or whatever you want to call it.
But they mentioned, so that here's, and this is like the secret game, right? We're getting this from a legend of a legend of a legend, which is barely good information at that. But it's a very interesting tidbit of this story that nobody talks about. Because Solon was a very important character. In his life, he was a lawmaker. He was a lot of things. And to find some of this information, I had to go through a variety of different places, not just the normal Plato's works, because there's other historians that talk about Solon, and that's how I started getting into the actual name of the priest and the name of what happened and a bunch of all this like legends and stuff. But a lot of it also comes from, and just for the listeners if they're interested, Manly P. Hall's The Hypothesis of Atlantis. It's a very good work. It's very complicated. This was another man that dedicated his life to the search of this ancient civilization. Not just the Atlantean one, but every single other one. So that's a work if you guys are interested. But the part that takes me back to this whole idea is we kind of forget the most important bit of this whole story. It's the knowledge aspect of it. One thing that they mention is the fact that they wanted to transfer the knowledge. They did not want that knowledge to die. And I think that's, if anything, that's the one thing that we can see as a staple point of all the different civilizations, like the one that you said you haven't heard of. If anything, all these structures and monuments that we consider to be completely fantastical and mysterious, maybe inside of them we would understand someday there is some type of knowledge that's built into it. And at some point in time that we're sufficiently advanced enough that we can understand it, can we then unravel those mysteries of those ancient times? And I think that's exactly the thing about, or exactly the problem that we're going to find a solution to hopefully soon in Egypt and Sumeria and all these different places in South America. I think all these different megalithic structures are hiding something, and it might not be something that's hidden, an actual, piece of treasure, but in their construction and in their creation, in the reasons of why they were created and things like that. I think inside of that, we'll find the true remnants of these civilizations.
I find that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, good. We've come down to the bottom of our hour. Do you have any small tidbits you want to throw to the audience?
Well, apart from Solon's ideas, well, one thing that we talked about was the position of it, right?
The position
of Atlantis.
The location.
So I think we talked about this before in another podcast, the out-of-place artifacts ones, the orichalcum, right?
Sure.
That mythical amalgamation of metals that was found in Poseidonis. So apparently there's a couple of different... I forget the name of the shipwreck, but one of the shipwreck was found. It was a Portuguese vessel that apparently contained orichalcum.
Yeah, I saw that there's some on display at one of the museums.
Yeah, which was amazing, like something that was literally completely mythical. And then another point, like a lot of this idea, right? A lot of the musings of civilization that was, myth and legend. I mean, we can think of the Iliad, right? I mean, that's what I always think about. Like, for the longest time, people thought that Homer was just talking about crazy stuff when he wrote the Iliad, but then they found Troy, So I think at some point in time, we're going to come to a point as a culture that we're going to figure out that even though the remnants are sparse and almost completely gone, the fact that we have the traceability and just the tidbits of myths and legend that mention all these great works, I think it's going to allow us to open up a completely new universe of ideas and theories and just amazing things that we've never even thought about. Because if anything, I think very similar to what it was described in the book, the advancements of these civilizations, not just the Atlantis ones, but the previous ones, are something that we ourselves have strayed from. Because there's another idea that we have barely enough time, and I wanted to mention it, that it's more of a psychological idea of what happened when the deluge occurred. So the Younger Dryas catastrophic event. So there's this idea that due to this hugely, catastrophic and traumatic experience, the population as a whole had a sort of PTSD that caused the creation of the ego.
Excuse me. So you're saying that the deluge caused us to have ego?
Yeah. Like the birth of the ego came due to this great, and we should probably have a complete episode on just this because it's deep stuff.
That seems pretty thick, yeah.
Yeah, but it's an interesting thing to think of. Like the actual, because think about it. When you have such a massive event, that type of event will not come without consequences. That type of event will not come without something that's going to be remembered across the eons of time. And I think, if anything, that's why you see such an importance in astronomy and astrology across all the ancient cultures. Think about it. All of them were completely, 100% engaged in understanding the stars and understanding the workings of the celestials, right? And why is that? If not because of a great trauma that they had from something that came from the sky.
With all comedy aside, there are people like the famous George Tsoukalos who would say that they're
aliens.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I don't want to touch on that now. That's something for later. But
I think that's arrogance. It's arrogance of a species now which thinks, and again, back to the point of Plato, I think we're right there right now. We are a civilization that is a very, very, very highly advanced civilization. We've come to the point of becoming an incredibly, well, I wouldn't say 100% fair, because we are not 100% fair. We are very imbalanced. But we're in a much better place than we are now in comparisons to our ancestors. 100 years ago, we would have had a very difficult life. So life is a little bit better than 100 years ago. We can definitely say that.
Well, I think the word difficult might be a little different. There was, if you look back at the Indian tribes, mm-hmm. I don't know that their life was particularly difficult. And again, I'm not Native American.
I get your point. Now, all I'm trying to say is, in our own way, we have reached a pinnacle of civilization.
Of course, and we can agree on.
And in that pinnacle, we have already ran into that hubris and into arrogance. And you can see climate change as an effect of that. You can see how little people care about what's going to happen in the next 100, 200 years.
That's true.
And if you cycle that back to what we were talking about originally, right? The idea of this great civilization and how it fell, I think, if anything, we're already in the same tracks of that. We're already in the place of having the same type of arrogance. And when Tsoukalos says that whole idea of, this is all aliens, the reason I say arrogance is because it's us that we think that we are the only true masters of the universe, right? We are only the one time in the whole 5.6 billion years that the Earth has been here that we have gone to the pinnacle of what we now know as civilization. That's where the arrogance, I think, comes from. I think that it's very difficult for people to think that in a long time past, there was a civilization that was more advanced than we are, but in a different way.
Sure. Well, this has been a very insightful conversation. I want to toss a question out to the audience, though. Do you guys think that Atlantis was real? And more importantly, as Joe asked earlier, where did you first hear about it?
Yeah.
What were your first impressions? So leave us a comment down below, and by all means, if you have another topic you'd like us to cover, feel free to send us an email at Bo&Joe podcast.
Yep.
at gmail.com. And this has been a great conversation. We hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. I'm Bo.
I'm Joe.
Have a good one.